Hello, my name is Jason, and I'm going to be talking about Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke today. It's been a while since I read this book, but let me start off by saying that this is a tome. Other than the Bible and Les Miserables, this is probably the longest book I've read. I've read The Lord of the Rings, and I've read Journey to the West, but each of those, Lord of the Rings is broken up into 3 different books. The Journey to the West was volumes 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell all in one volume. So it's quite hefty. To be fair, probably heftier than it needs to be. It was a good book. I did enjoy it. It starts out with some gentlemen, English gentlemen, and they're in England. You can think of this as an alternate reality. It starts in England during the Napoleonic era. Anyway, these gentlemen, they're the magical society of, I forget what the name of the area is, but they're theoretical magicians. There haven't been any practical magicians in hundreds of years in England. Nobody knows why, but it just seems that there's no such thing as a practicing magician anymore. No magic, nothing. At one point there was plenty, and these men get together and they discuss magic and all that stuff. Anyway, they find out that there's a gentleman named Mr. Norrell who professes to be a magician. They think him much like themselves, and he's been collecting magical books for years, so they go to visit him in his house. And he tells them that no, he's a practical magician, not a theoretical magician. And he tells them that he's going to demonstrate his power, but not before they agree to sign a thing saying that if he demonstrates that he can produce magic, they will give up the title, basically. So he says, go to this cathedral at this particular time and date, and you will see magic. And there's one man who doesn't sign the petition, or doesn't sign the agreement. He agrees to be kind of an observer and write down what happens, but he doesn't agree to go along with it. The rest of the club does. So they go to this cathedral, and the statues come to life. They start talking and interacting with the gentlemen of this club, and by so doing, they agree not to be labeled magicians anymore, and they give up the title. So this then catapults him into notoriety, Mr. Norrell, I should say, catapults him into notoriety, and he moves to London, because that's where everybody goes when they when they become famous. They go to London. Anyway, he goes to London, where he raises a young woman from the dead. She dies. He makes an agreement with this man that they just call him the man with the thistle-down hair. And he makes an agreement. She comes back to life, and that's the beginning of his adventures. We then move to Jonathan Strange. Jonathan Strange is a much younger man, and he's pursuing a young woman, and he has money, so he doesn't actually need to have a job. It's kind of weird. I've never been put in that kind of situation where I didn't have to have a job. Even when I was younger, my parents, my grandparents, had to have a job. Anyway, so he was asked what his pursuits were, what he was going to do, and he decided magician. And so he began pursuing magic. And so he ends up going to London too, because he hears about Mr. Norrell, and they clash. There's not an entire agreement, not eye to eye kind of thing between the two of them. But Jonathan Strange becomes Mr. Norrell's apprentice. Now, as I said, this is set kind of in the time of the Napoleonic era. At one point, the ministers of England are approaching Mr. Norrell and Jonathan to find out how magic can help the war effort on the continent. And Jonathan, at one point, does leave England and go to the continent so that he can aid in the war effort. And he uses magic to disrupt troops and confuse the French and all that goes along with it. He tries to refrain from killing by magic, but he doesn't refrain from using magic to confuse paths and create fogs, that kind of thing, create illusions. He's very much, Mr. Norrell and Jonathan Strange are very much opposites of each other. Mr. Norrell is what you would think of as a traditional English temperament, reserved, very calm. Jonathan Strange, on the other hand, is more outgoing, much more wanting to be around people and interact and that kind of thing. And so he feels comfortable at parties, where Mr. Norrell feels very uncomfortable at parties. Jonathan Strange, the much more likable of the two, and there ends up being a rift between the two gentlemen that's kind of along these lines, where people are drawn to Jonathan and not to Mr. Norrell, other than the fact that they kind of view magic and the fairy tales and things that go along with it. They view them in much different lights. There's a character in that they reference several times called the Raven King, who was once one of the most powerful magicians in all of England, also the King of England, according to the legends. And Mr. Norrell disdains the Raven King and all mention of him, whereas Jonathan Strange sees him as the ideal, that if it wasn't for him, there wouldn't be magic in England. So very much this dichotomy of personalities that works pretty well together. Now, as I said, this is a tome. It's quite in-depth. There's a lot of history and backstory that Susanna Clarke brings into the novel. And once again, as I said, probably didn't need all of it. Now, needless to say, there's more going on here than just what I have listed. There's more going on, because there are characters that were introduced. I talked about the man with the thistledown hair. He becomes an antagonist later, but one that's very sneaky and determined to move behind the scenes so that nobody knows what he's doing. And very much this the war effort against Napoleon is devoted to quite extensively in the book as well. I liked it, regardless of any criticism that I'm leveling against it. I like to say that because I was once talking to a friend of mine about a movie, and if you had listened to the two of us talking about this movie, you would have thought we hated the thing. Just hated it. Couldn't stand it. The thing is that there were a lot of problems with the movie, but that being said, we still enjoyed it. It was still an enjoyable movie. This is an enjoyable book. I want to get that out there. But it took a while, because there were parts of the book that kind of bogged down with, in my opinion, unnecessary detail. I think I read recently on a website that Susanna Clarke is planning a sequel to Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is good. It kind of ended in a way that opened itself and lent itself well to continuing the story of these two gentlemen, which I would like to see. There were some resolutions, some things that needed to be resolved that weren't at the end of the book. So I'm looking forward to that. If you have any questions or comments about anything that I've said, please note them down below. Also, like and subscribe, and as always, like what you're reading. Enjoy it. Bye.